Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this very interesting presentation. With us today, we have the CEO of Saniona, Rami Levin, and welcome to the audience as well. And just a couple of practical issues. If you want to post a question, you do it on your right below. This is your chat pod. Just post the question. And I will post all the questions for Rami in the end of the presentation. This is an introduction to Saniona, a very interesting rare disease company, and the session will last for around 30 minutes, including Q&A. I would like to hand over the word to Rami Levin. Welcome, Rami, and go on.
Thank you, Klaus, and thank you for having me. And good morning and good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are. And I'm excited and happy to be here and share our exciting story about Saniona and who we are. So I'll start by saying, or talking about our vision. Who are we and what are we trying to become? We're currently a relatively small company, a clinical stage company. About 50 employees, about 25 in Europe and about 25 in the US. But we have a very clear vision of building a rare disease biopharma company. And for those who are maybe not that familiar with rare diseases and how you define rare diseases, so what is a rare disease? Defined slightly different between the US and Europe. In the US, a rare disease is defined of having less than 200,000 patients. In Europe, it's slightly different. It's less than 5 patients in every 10,000 people. But regardless of how it's defined, the similarities between the two, obviously, is that these are very small indications with very few patients. There's a huge unmet medical need when it comes to rare diseases. There are about 7,000 rare diseases known today, and only slightly over 600 or so treatments are available. So less than 10% of the rare disease actually have treatments available. So a huge, huge unmet medical need. About half of those rare diseases are actually rare diseases that impact children. There's a lot of incentives in developing rare diseases, whether those be faster and smaller clinical trials when comparing to larger, more broader indications. There are some tax benefit and of course, market exclusivity when you launch a rare disease. For those who are wondering why rare disease and why invest in kind of smaller indications, the companies below that you see here is really just to illustrate that these are very attractive areas to be in. And here are just some of the companies that are focused predominantly on rare diseases, and you can see the value of these companies. And I can tell you that many on our team have worked in these companies and others and bring that experience into Saniona to do the exact same thing here at Saniona. So who are we? As I mentioned, we are a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company. We are focused on discovering, developing, and ultimately, as we get closer to commercialization, also commercialize our innovative treatments for rare diseases. We are publicly traded on NASDAQ in Stockholm. Our research organization is based in Copenhagen. And over the past 2 years, we spent time and effort to build our corporate office here in the Boston area. Our lead asset that we are developing is a product called Tesomet, which we are developing for 2 rare disorders. The first one is hypothalamic obesity, and the second one is Prader-Willi syndrome. In both indications, we conducted a phase 2 trial. We have been in dialogue with the FDA, and towards the end of 21, we actually initiated our next phase of clinical trials, which is a phase 2B trial in both. So both are currently in phase 2B trials. We are expecting the results from the hypothalamic obesity to come in the second half of 2023, next year. In PWS, we expect the results in the first half of next year, simply because the trial is slightly shorter. But unlike many companies at our stage that typically have one product, we also have a drug discovery engine. And what that drug discovery engine will do for us is it will fuel our future pipeline of products. For example, we have SAN711, which we are exploring for rare neuropathic disorders. SAN711 initiated a phase 1 back in June. The study is ongoing, and we're expecting results from the phase 1 trial by the end of the first half of this year. Behind SAN711, we have SAN903, which is about a year or so behind SAN711. We are targeting SAN903 for rare inflammatory, fibrotic, and hematological disorders, and we expect to initiate phase 1 with SAN903 in the second half of this year. And then behind SAN711 and SAN903, we have a whole database of ion channels, over 130,000, in fact, ion channels, of which 20,000 of them are proprietary to us. And we have a very clear goal to continue to data mine and investigate that database with the goal of finding or identifying the next molecule to bring out of research into preclinical development, with the hope to advance that through clinical development and ultimately commercialization. We will be announcing that next molecule later this year, of what that next molecule will be behind SAN903. So these first two pillars, the Tesomet and the ion channel drug discovery engine, is really where most of our focus is today. But we also have a few critical partnerships in place. And those partnerships will do two things for us. Number one, what they already do is they obviously validate our science. These are mostly large companies that opted to partner with Saniona to in-license our molecules for their research. And I think that in itself validates the quality of the science that we are developing. But number two, what it will do down the road is it will fuel additional revenue coming into the company. While this may not be our main revenue stream, it will be a secondary and important revenue stream coming into the company. And you can see some of the partnerships that we have in place. For example, CAD 1883 for movement disorders. This is a product in phase 2. It was out-licensed to Cadent Therapeutics, and in January of last year, actually, Cadent Therapeutics was acquired by Novartis. Once that deal was signed, Saniona received an upfront payment of $3 million, and we will be receiving milestone payments throughout the development and ultimately royalties if the product reaches the market. We also have an out-licensing agreement for a much earlier stage. This is a preclinical stage asset for their schizophrenia program, a partnership with Boehringer Ingelheim. Under this agreement, Saniona will be receiving up to $76 million in milestone payments throughout the development and ultimately royalties if the product reaches the market. And last but not least, tesofensine for general obesity. Saniona is not interested in general obesity. We out-licensed tesofensine to a company called Medix. Medix have obesity clinics in Mexico and Argentina. They conducted a phase 3, and with the positive results from that trial, they submitted the file for approval in Mexico. There have been some delays, mostly due to COVID. They're now in discussions with the Mexican authorities and expect to hear back during the first half of this year, with the hope to get the approval. Once the product is approved, Saniona will be receiving double-digit royalties on revenue. And once approved in Mexico, Medix intend to do the exact same thing in Argentina and get it approved there. Last but not least, we have strong institutional support, and that is a result of a raise that was done back in 2020. We have RA Capital, Pontifax, some of the pension funds as some of our large institutional investors. So briefly, just talking about our ion channel, this is really the foundation to who we are as a company. This is the science that drives and will drive our growth moving forward. Ion channel is a huge market. It's over $11 billion market today, despite the fact that only 20% of the ion channels are actually commercially available, which means there's a huge potential in this scientific area. And some of the advantages that we bring as a company is we bring years and years, over 20 years, in fact, of experience in research in ion channels. We have a database that we created, which we call IonBase, which consists of over 130 chemical entities, of which 20,000 are actually proprietary compounds to us. So a huge database to investigate, to continue to investigate and generate new molecules coming out from research and into preclinical and clinical development. For example, SAN711, which I mentioned is already in phase 1. SAN903 will move into phase 1 later this year, and we will be announcing a new drug candidate later this year as well. So a huge potential from our research team. But let's focus on our lead asset, Tesomet, which is currently in 2 phase 2b trials, both for hypothalamic obesity and Prader-Willi syndrome. So how does Tesomet work? So first of all, Tesomet is potentially a first-in-class medicine from Saniona, and potentially first-in-class in both hypothalamic obesity and Prader-Willi syndrome. Tesomet is a fixed-dose combination of tesofensine and metoprolol. And really what it does is it targets the 2 key areas in the brain that impact both hypothalamic obesity and Prader-Willi syndrome. And those are the reward center and the appetite center in the brain. It's a triple monoamine reuptake inhibitor, meaning that it increases the 3 monoamines that you see here, dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline. And by increasing them, it impacts directly what causes and creates the disease that we are targeting. So dopamine, by increasing dopamine, we actually reduce the craving for food. By increasing serotonin, we reduce the appetite. And by increasing noradrenaline, we increase the metabolic fat burn. All 3 components that impact both hypothalamic obesity and Prader-Willi syndrome. So what is hypothalamic obesity? Well, I'll start by saying there is no treatment for hypothalamic obesity, and Saniona and Tesomet is currently at the forefront of research and clinical development in this indication. It is a rare disease. There are about 10 to 25,000 patients in the US and between 16 and 40,000 patients in Europe. This is an acquired disease, so patients are not born with hypothalamic obesity. In most cases, or in all cases, it happens as a result of an injury to an area in the brain called hypothalamus. And in most of those cases, it's a result of a removal of a brain tumor called craniopharyngioma that sits on the hypothalamus. And once that brain tumor is removed, it causes an injury to the hypothalamus. And as a result of that injury to the hypothalamus, these patients very quickly become obese. Within less than a year, they become overweight. They have rapid and excessive weight gain that they cannot control. You have here in the picture an example of Ali on the left before her brain surgery, and literally a year later, and you can see the change in body weight in less than a year. Many of these people were healthy, were athletes, had craniopharyngioma or an injury to the hypothalamus, and within a year became obese, stopped exercising, and you can understand and imagine how this impacts their life. These patients also have memory impairment, attention deficits, and other impulse control issues. As I mentioned, there is no FDA-approved treatment today, and we are leading the way in clinical development in this area. So we conducted a phase 2. This is just one example of the data that we have. This is, in fact, our primary endpoint and will be the primary endpoint in the phase 2b trial, which I will discuss in a second. And what you can see here is the body weight reduction. The first 24 weeks were the blinded phase. The gray line on top is the placebo group, and the blue line at the bottom is the treatment group. And you can see the placebo group had a slight improvement to begin with, and that is predominantly because of the exercise and the diet that all patients had to undergo when entering the trial. But as you can see, just diet alone and exercise is not enough, because these placebo patients at the end, after 24 weeks, basically went back to baseline, whereas the patients who were on Tesomet continued to decline all the way down to a 6.28%, which was also highly statistically significant. It is important to say that the FDA considers significance anything above 5%. They consider clinically meaningful based on their weight management guidelines. So this is clearly above what the FDA would consider as clinically meaningful, which obviously is a good indication and led itself to the next clinical trial that we are doing. This was a relatively small trial. There were 21 patients who started it. 18 patients continued into the open label extension, which is the second part to the right that you can see here. After 24 weeks of placebo control, all patients were put on Tesomet. 18 patients started and 18 patients finished this open label extension. And you can see that the placebo group, once they were put on Tesomet, showed a very similar decline to what the patients on Tesomet saw or showed during the first 24 weeks. And again, about slightly over 5% decline, which is what we want to see. From a safety perspective, this was generally well-tolerated drug. Most common adverse events were really sleep disorders, insomnia, dizziness, dry mouth, and headache. And most were mild and moderate. So with this data, we met with the FDA many times and ultimately agreed on the next clinical trial, which is a phase 2b clinical trial, which is currently ongoing. This phase 2b trial is a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial for a 36-week period. And after 36 weeks, all patients are randomized into an open-label extension. Everyone is put on Tesomet on the highest tolerated dose. We are targeting about 110 patients, randomized 1:1:1:1:1 between the 4 groups. This is a global study with sites in the US and Europe and other countries. And the primary endpoint is what I just shared, is the change in body weight. And as I mentioned, we are expecting the top-line results from this study in the second half of next year. The other indication we are targeting is Prader-Willi syndrome. Unlike hypothalamic obesity, Prader-Willi is actually a genetic disorder. Patients are actually born with Prader-Willi syndrome. Similarly, this is a rare disease. There are about 11 to 34,000 patients in the US and between 17 and 50,000 patients in Europe. The cause for this is actually a genetic disorder. It's an absent or defective paternally expressed gene on chromosome 15. And the main characteristics of this disease, the most impactful, is actually hyperphagia. Hyperphagia is this uncontrollable need to always eat. These patients eat all the time. They eat out of the fridge. They raid the pantry. They eat food off the floor. They would eat food off out of the garbage can. The most challenging and most significant burden on the family is this hyperphagia, because the families have to keep the fridge locked. They have to keep the cupboards locked because they will steal food. They will go to their neighbors and steal food. They just can't control the need to always eat, which is also why many of these have a short life expectancy of 30 to 40 years old. Many of them have a lot of obesity-related morbidities, abnormalities, and health issues as a result of that. Very, very challenging disease. There is no approved therapy for hyperphagia, and we are contending to be the first treatment available in hyperphagia in Prader-Willi as well. Similar to hypothalamic obesity, we conducted a phase 2 trial that you can see here. This is a small trial. This is the adult portion of that study. On the left, you can see the body weight reduction, and you can see the gray, which is placebo, and the treatment group, which is in blue. And we were able to see a 5.4% reduction in body weight, which was not statistically significant in this case, but this is primarily because of the very small patient numbers. There were 9 patients only in this part of the study. On the right side, however, hyperphagia, this is actually the primary endpoint in Prader-Willi syndrome and will be the primary endpoint of the clinical trial that is currently ongoing. What we were able to see with Tesomet in reducing hyperphagia, similarly here, the gray line is the placebo group and the blue line is the treatment group. We were able to see an 8.1 points reduction in hyperphagia, highly statistically significant. And just to give a bit of perspective, when speaking to the patient groups, and actually wrote a white paper about it, the patient groups and the patients said that they would be willing to take a drug that has a 5-point reduction in hyperphagia, even if it had side effects, because they have nothing, just to show you how large the 8.1 points reduction is and how meaningful that would be to patients if and when it reaches the market. And based on this, we met with the FDA, and similar to HO, we are currently conducting a phase 2b clinical trial in Prader-Willi syndrome. The first 16 weeks are a double-blind placebo controlled trial with 4 arms, 3 Tesomet arms versus placebo. You can see the doses here, 0.125, 0.25, and 0.375. And after 6 weeks of double-blind, all patients will be put on Tesomet and will continue for a 36 open label extension on the highest tolerated dose. Similarly, we're targeting about 120 patients. This will be also an international study, including US and countries in Europe. And the primary endpoint, unlike HO, here the primary endpoint is actually hyperphagia. This is a shorter trial, and therefore the top-line data for H1 is expected in H1 next year. So some of our key milestones and what to expect over the next couple of years. Just looking a bit back in 21, some of the things that we have achieved in advancing our clinical and regulatory discussions. So we received orphan drug designation both for Tesomet in Prader-Willi syndrome and for Tesomet in hypothalamic obesity. I will say that in hypothalamic obesity, no drug has ever received orphan drug designation for hypothalamic obesity. Tesomet was actually the first one to have ever received orphan drug designation. We started our phase 1 trial with SAN711. Results from that trial are expected by the end of the first half of this year. When we also started our 2 phase 2b trials that I just mentioned, both in hypothalamic obesity and in Prader-Willi syndrome. So looking into 22 and 23, what are we to expect? So as I mentioned, top-line results from phase 1 expected in the first half of this year. SAN903 will move into phase 1 in the second half of next year. We are expecting an approval determination of tesofensine for general obesity in Mexico by our partner Medix. As I mentioned, once approved, Saniona will be receiving double-digit royalties on their net sales. And we are expecting to announce a new ion channel modulator that will advance from our research into preclinical development. Moving into next year is when the results from our 2 phase 2b trials will come, from Prader-Willi syndrome to begin with in the first half, and from hypothalamic obesity in the second half of next year. And this is really just to illustrate how we view us building the company as a rare disease company moving forward. We have the advantage of having a variety of assets, of having a drug discovery engine, all of which will fuel our growth moving forward. So if you look at the chart with the people, and there is no really meaning for the colors here, starting with Tesomet for HO and PWS, obviously this is our most advanced asset, and our goal is to bring this to the market as quickly as we can. Behind Tesomet and in HO and PWS, we have SAN711, which is already started phase 1 for neuropathic disorders, and then about a year behind that, SAN903 for rare inflammatory disorders. We will then be exploring our library of over 20,000 ion channel modifiers. And as I mentioned, we will already announce this year the next molecule coming out into preclinical development. We will also be looking at life cycle management. Life cycle management specifically meaning looking at what other indications all these drugs could potentially be beneficial in beyond just the leading indication that we are targeting. And then, of course, looking externally, business development. We hired a chief business officer whose whole goal is to explore business development opportunities, whether those be to begin with out-licensing opportunities, but down the road also in-licensing opportunities, finding those right treatments that fit the portfolio of the company to help us build and grow. And to give you a sense of kind of the size or the potential size of the markets that we are looking at, when it comes to hypothalamic obesity and Prader-Willi syndrome, if we look at some of the third-party analysts and their estimates, they're estimating that Tesomet could be an $850 to over $1 billion market at peak. If you look at some of the indications, even though we haven't really announced officially the indication for SAN711 nor for 903, some of the areas that we are looking at, if you compare those or look at those markets, these are $1 billion and $2 billion respectively, or over $1 billion, over $2 billion respectively in those indications that we are looking at. So the potential here is huge, even though we are a rare disease company. And with that, I'd like to thank you and thank everyone for your attention. And Klaus, I pass it on to you for any question.
Thanks a lot, Rami. A great presentation. Well, first of all, there's actually a lot of questions, but and some of the questions you asked, you answered during the presentation. But there's an interesting question for a couple of participants regarding rare diseases and fast track from FDA. And have you pursued that? Have you applied for fast track if you get fast track for rare diseases? Could you comment a little on that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Yes. So when it comes to rare diseases, does you receive a fast track from FDA on rare diseases? And have you applied for fast track though?
Yeah. So we haven't yet received, the normal processes. You'll apply, and of course, when we receive, if we receive, we'll of course inform the market. But we are in constant dialogue with the FDA. Again, now that we have the orphan drug designation, we will be applying for a variety of different things that are common and typical in rare diseases, fast track being one of them.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. And then there's a couple of questions regarding your partnership with Medrex in Mexico. So if they succeed to get the product approved in Mexico and after that in Argentina, would you pursue other partnerships with tesofensine in other markets?
We would. We're not focused on tesofensine, so I think if there are companies that would be interested to commercialize tesofensine in those markets for general obesity, using the phase 3 data that was already generated in Mexico, which was very positive, then we would definitely consider out licensing to other countries as well.
Yeah, and maybe you in that relation, you should maybe tell the audience what is your strategy, because you mentioned that for me in terms of funding your own project and then looking for partnerships, because that's probably you will probably answer the question in that sense.
Sure. So I mentioned in my presentation that we hired a chief business officer with a very clear goal to look at business development opportunities. And when we talk about business development opportunities, what I specifically mean being a rare disease company with a pipeline and with a drug discovery engine, what it means is that as we discover new molecules, we will obviously let the science drive the direction of which indications we need to pursue based on that science. What that means is that in some cases, the science will say there are very good rare diseases that this particular molecule could apply in. If that is the case, our goal is to develop it ourselves. However, the science may also show that some of the molecules that we are looking at may have a better application in larger, broader indications. And in those cases, being a rare disease company, we would probably prefer to out-license that molecule to larger companies for them to develop and for them to commercialize. The other thing that we are looking at is, of course, ultimately our goal will be to become a global rare disease company. But we also have to be realistic in the short term of what we can and can't achieve, right? We're currently a small company. In 3-4 years, could we have affiliates everywhere around the world? Probably unlikely. 10 years, 8 years, that may be different. But in the short term, probably unlikely. So I think there could also possibly be opportunities to out-license geographically in some of the geographies where we do not plan to commercialize ourselves. We may want to partner or out-license to other companies in those geographies. So the out-licensing in a nutshell could either be a geographical reason where we can't commercialize ourselves, or it could be for science reasons where these are indications that are not rare diseases and therefore are not core to what we are focused on.
Well, thanks a lot, Rami. And then maybe a final question. Have you experienced any problems recruiting patients to your studies? And of course, I could imagine that question is in relation to the current pandemic.
That's a great question. So currently, I would say not, although the studies have just started. But what we have taken into account, so we've taken the pandemic into account, and what we have done in our study, typically in every study, you know, there are patient visits, they come to the hospital, they have to do their tests and exams in every study. But what we did in our study is we converted many of those to home visits where the patients actually do not have to come to the hospital. And that's good for two reasons. Number one is, of course, trying to be safe and prevent these patients from going to the hospital and getting sick. But number two, these specific patients that we are targeting, both predominantly in Prader-Willi syndrome, they get very nervous when their environment changed. They would get very nervous when they have to go to hospital. So changing it to a home visit where they don't have to leave their house actually benefits for those two reasons. One is it doesn't change the environment for them. Number two, it doesn't put them in harm by getting them to the hospital. So there will be a handful of hospital visits. You can't avoid them, but those were reduced quite dramatically in both studies. And that's how we are actually handling the pandemic.
Thanks a lot, Rami. And with that, I would like to thanks first of all, Rami, for a great presentation. And we hope that we answered most of the questions. And secondly, I would like to thank the participants for interacting during this presentation. So thank you, and have a really nice day, everybody.